In Defense of Women by H.L Mencken. 38. Pathological Effects. This feminine craving for martyrdom, of course, often takes on a downright pathological character, and so engages a psychiatrist. Women show many other traits of the same sort. To be a woman under our Christian civilization, indeed, means to live a life that is heavy with repression and dissimulation. And this repression and dissimulation, in the long run, cannot fail to produce effects that are indistinguishable from disease. You will find some of them described at length in any handbook on psychoanalysis. The Viennese, Adler, and the Dane, Paul Bier, argue indeed that womanliness itself, as it is encountered under Christianity, is a disease. All women suffer from a suppressed revolt against the inhibitions forced upon them by our artificial culture, and this suppressed revolt, by well-known Freudian means, produces a complex of mental symptoms that is familiar to all of us. At one end of the scale we observe the suffragette with her grotesque adoption of the male belief in laws, phrases, and talismans, and her hysterical demand for a sexual libertarianism that she could not put to use if she had it. And at the other end we find the snuffling and neurotic woman, with her bogus martyrdom, her extravagant pruderies, and her pathological delusions. As Ibsen observed long ago, this is a man's world. Women have broken many of their old chains, but they are still enmeshed in a formidable network of man-made taboos and sentimentalities, and it will take them another generation, at least, to get genuine freedom. That this is true is shown by the deep unrest that yet marks the sex, despite its recent progress towards social, political, and economic equality. It is almost impossible to find a man who honestly wishes that he were a woman, but almost every woman, at some time or other in her life, is gnawed by a regret that she is not a man. Two of the hardest things that women have to bear are A, the stupid masculine disinclination to admit their intellectual superiority, or even their equality, or even their possession of a normal human equipment for thought, and B, the equally stupid and masculine doctrine that they constitute a special and ineffable species of vertebrata, without the natural instincts and appetites of the order. To adapt the phrase from Haeckel, that they are transcendental and almost gaseous mammals, and marked by a complete lack of certain salient mammalian characters. The first imbecility has already concerned us at length. One finds traces of it even in the works professedly devoted to disposing of it. In one such book, for example, I come upon this, quote, "What all the skill and constructive capacity of the physicians in the Crimean War failed to accomplish, Florence Nightingale accomplished by her beautiful femininity and nobility of soul." End quote. In other words, by her possession of some recondite and indescribable magic, sharply separated from the ordinary mental processes of man. The theory is unsound and preposterous. Miss Nightingale accomplished her useful work not by magic, but by hard common sense. The problem before her was simply one of organization. Many men had tackled it, and all of them had failed stupendously. What she did was to bring her feminine sharpness of wit, her feminine clear thinking, to bear upon it. Thus attacked, it yielded quickly, and once it had been brought to order, it was easy for other persons to carry on what she had begun. But the opinion of a man's world still prefers to credit her success to some mysterious angelical quality, unstateable in lucid terms, and having no more reality than the divine inspiration of an archbishop. Her extraordinarily acute and accurate intelligence is thus conveniently put upon the table, and the amour propre of man is kept inviolate. To confess frankly that she had more sense than any male Englishman of her generation would be to utter a truth too harsh to be bearable. The second delusion commonly shows itself in the theory, already discussed, that women are devoid of any sex instinct, that they submit to the odious caresses of the lubricious male only by a powerful effort of will, and with the sole object of discharging their duty to posterity. It would be impossible to go into this delusion with proper candor and at due length in a work designed for reading aloud in the domestic circle. All I can do is refer the student to books of any competent authority on the psychology of sex, say Ellis, or to the confidences, if they are obtainable, of any complacent bachelor of his acquaintance. 39. Women as Christians. The glad tidings preached by Christ were obviously highly favorable to women. He lifted them to equality before the Lord when their very possession of souls was still doubted by the majority of rival theologians. Moreover, he esteemed them socially and set value upon their sagacity, and one of the most disdained of their sex, a lady formerly in public life, was among his regular advisers. Mariolatry is thus by no means the invention of the medieval popes, as Protestant theologians would have us believe. On the contrary, it is plainly discernible in the four Gospels. What the medieval popes actually invented, or to be precise, reinvented, for they simply borrowed the elements of it from St. Paul, was the doctrine of women's inferiority, the precise opposite of the thing credited to them. Committed, for sound reasons of discipline, to the celibacy of the clergy, they had to support it by depicting all traffic with women in the light of a hazardous and ignominious business. The result was the deliberate organization and development of the theory of female triviality, lack of responsibility, and general looseness of mind. Woman became a sort of devil, but without the admired intelligence of the regular demons. The appearance of women saints, however, offered a constant and embarrassing criticism of this idiotic doctrine. If occasional women were fit to sit upon the right hand of God, and they were often proving it and forcing the church to acknowledge it, then surely all women could not be as bad as the books made them out. There thus arose the concept of the angelic women, the natural vestal. We see her at full length in the romances of medieval chivalry. What emerged in the end was a sort of double doctrine: first, that women were devils, and secondly, that they were angels. This preposterous dualism has merged, as we have seen, into a compromised dogma in modern times. By that dogma it is held on the one hand that women are unintelligent and immoral, and on the other hand that they are free from all those weaknesses of the flesh which distinguish men. Thus, roughly speaking, is the notion of the average male numbskull today. Christianity has thus both libeled women and flattered them, but with the weight always on the side of the libel. It is therefore at bottom their enemy, as the religion of Christ, now wholly extinct, was their friend. And as they gradually throw off the shackles that have bound them for 1,000 years, they show appreciation of the fact. Women indeed are not naturally religious, and they are growing less and less religious as year chases year. Their ordinary devotion has little if any pious exaltation in it. It is a routine practice forced on them by the masculine notion that an appearance of holiness is proper to their lowly station, and a masculine feeling that church-going somehow keeps them in order and out of doings that would be less reassuring. When they exhibit any genuine religious fervor, its sexual character is usually so obvious that even the majority of men are cognizant of it. Women never go flocking ecstatically to a church in which the agent of God in the pulpit is an elderly asthmatic with a watchful wife. When one finds them driven to frenzies by the merits of the saints, and weeping over the sorrows of the heathen, and rushing out to haul the whole vicinage up to grace, and spending hours on their knees in hysterical abasement before the heavenly throne, it is quite safe to assume, even without an actual visit, that the ecclesiastic who has worked the miracle is a fair and toothsome fellow, and a good deal more aphrodisiacal than learned. All the great preachers to women in modern times have been men of suave and ingratiating habit, and the great majority of them, from Henry Ward Beecher up and down, have been taken, soon or late, in transactions far more suitable to the boudoir than to the footstool of the Almighty. Their famous killings have always been made among the silliest sort of women, the sort, in brief, who fall so short of the normal acumen of their sex that they are bemused by mere beauty in men. Such women are in the minority, and so the sex shows a good deal fewer religious enthusiasts per mill than the sex of sentiment and belief. Attending several years ago the gladiatorial shows of the Reverend Dr. Billy Sunday, the celebrated American pulpit clown, I was constantly struck by the great preponderance of males in the pen devoted to the saved. Men of all ages and in enormous numbers came swarming to the altar, loudly bawling for help against their sins, but the women were anything but numerous, and the few who appeared were chiefly either chlorotic adolescents or pathetic old Southern Western. For 6 nights running I sat directly beneath the gifted exhorter without seeing a single female convert of what statisticians call the childbearing age, That is, the age of maximum intelligence and charm. Among the male simpletons bagged by his yells during this time were the president of a railroad, half a dozen rich bankers and merchants, and the former governor of an American state. But not a woman of comparable position or dignity, not a woman that any self-respecting bachelor would care to chuck under the chin. This cynical view of religious emotionalism, and with it of the whole stock of ecclesiastical balderdash, is probably responsible, at least in part, for the reluctance of women to enter upon the sacerdotal career. In those Christian sects which still bar them from the pulpit, usually on the imperfectly concealed ground that they are not equal to its alleged demands upon the morals and the intellect, one never hears of them protesting against the prohibition. They are quite content to leave the degrading imposture to men, who are better fitted for it by talent and conscience. And in those Baroque sects, chiefly American, which admit them, they show no eagerness to put on the stole and chasuble. When the first clergywoman appeared in the United States, it was predicted by alarmists that men would be driven out of the pulpit by the new competition. Nothing of the sort has occurred, nor is it in prospect. The whole corps of female divines in the country might be herded into one small room. Women, when literate at all, are far too intelligent to make effective ecclesiastics. Their sharp sense of reality is in endless opposition to the whole sacerdotal masquerade, and their cynical humor stands against the snorting that is inseparable from pulpit oratory. Those women who enter upon the religious life are almost invariably moved by some motive distinct from mere pious inflammation. It is a commonplace, indeed, that in Catholic countries girls are driven into convents by economic considerations or by disasters of amour far oftener than they are drawn there by the hope of heaven. Read the lives of the female saints, and you will see how many of them tried marriage and failed at it before they ever turned to religion. In Protestant lands, very few women adopt it as a profession at all, and among the few a secular impulse is almost always visible. The girl who is suddenly overcome by a desire to minister to the heathen in foreign lands is nearly invariably found on inspection to be a girl harboring a theory that it would be agreeable to marry some heroic missionary. In point of fact, she duly marries him. At home, perhaps, she has found it impossible to get a husband, but in the remoter marches of China, Senegal, and Somaliland, with no white competition present, it is equally impossible to fail. 40. Piety as a social habit. What remains of the alleged piety of women is little more than a social habit, reinforced in most communities by a paucity of other and more inviting divertissements. If you have ever observed the women of Spain and Italy at their devotions, you need not be told how much the worship of God may be a mere excuse for relaxation and gossip. These women, in their daily lives, are surrounded by a formidable network of medieval taboos. Their normal human desire for ease and freedom in intercourse is opposed by masculine distrust and superstition. They meet no strangers, they see and hear nothing new. In the house of the Most High, they escape from that vexing routine. Here they may brush shoulders with a crowd. Here, so to speak, they may crane their mental necks and stretch their spiritual legs. Here, above all, they may come into some sort of contact with men relatively more affable, cultured, and charming than their husbands and fathers, to wit, with the reverend clergy. Elsewhere in Christendom, though women are not quite so relentlessly watched and penned up, they feel much the same need of variety and excitement, and both are likewise on tap in the temples of the Lord. No one, I am sure, need be told that the average missionary society or church sewing circle is not primary religious organization. Its actual purpose is precisely that of the absurd clubs and secret orders to which the lower and least resourceful classes of men belong. It offers a mean of refreshment, of self-expression, of personal display, of political manipulation and boasting, and, if the pastor happens to be interesting, of discreet and almost lawful intrigue. In the course of a life largely devoted to the study of pietistic phenomena, I have never met a single woman who cared an authentic damn for the actual heathen. The attraction in their salvation is almost purely social. Women go to church for the same reason that farmers and convicts go to church. Finally, there is the aesthetic lure. Religion, in most parts of Christendom, holds out the only bait of beauty that the inhabitants are ever cognizant of. It offers music, dim lights, relatively ambitious architecture, eloquence, formality, and mystery, the caressing meaninglessness that is at the heart of poetry. Women are far more responsive to such things than men, who are ordinarily quite as devoid of aesthetic sensitiveness as so many oxen. The attitude of the typical man toward beauty in its various forms is, in fact, an attitude of suspicion and hostility. He does not regard a work of art as merely inert and stupid. He regards it as, in some indefinable way, positively offensive. He sees the artist as a professional voluptuary and scoundrel, and would no more trust him in his household than he would trust a colored clergyman in his hen-yard. It was men and not women who invented such sordid and literal faiths as those of the Mennonites, Dunkards, Wesleyans, and Scotch Presbyterians, with their antipathy to beautiful ritual, their obscene buttonholing of God, their great talent for reducing the ineffable mystery of religion to a mere bawling of idiots. The normal woman, in so far as she has any religion at all, moves irresistibly towards Catholicism with its poetical obscurantism. The evangelical Protestant sects have a hard time holding her. She can no more be an actual Methodist than a gentleman can be a Methodist. This inclination towards beauty, of course, is dismissed by the average male blockhead as no more than a feeble sentimentality. The truth is that it is precisely the opposite. It is surely not sentimentality to be moved by the stately and mysterious ceremony of the Mass, or even, say, by those timid imitations of it which one observes in certain Protestant churches. Such proceedings, whatever their defects from the standpoint of a pure aesthetic, are at all events vastly more beautiful than any of the private acts of the folk who take part in them. They lift themselves above the barren utilitarianism of everyday life, and no less above the maudlin sentimentalities that men seek pleasure in. They offer a means of escape, convenient and inviting, from the sordid routine of thought and occupation which women revolt against so pertinaciously. 41. The Ethics of Women. I have said that the religion preached by Jesus, now wholly extinct in the world, was highly favorable to women. This was not saying, of course, that women have repaid the compliment by adopting it. They are, in fact, indifferent Christians in the primitive sense, just as they are bad Christians in the antagonistic modern sense, and particularly on the side of ethics. If they actually accept the renunciations commanded by the Sermon on the Mount, it is only in an effort to flout their substance under cover of their appearance. No woman is really humble. She is merely politic. No woman, with a free choice before her, chooses self-immolation. The most she genuinely desires in that direction is a spectacular martyrdom. No woman delights in poverty. No woman yields when she can prevail. No woman is honestly meek. In their practical ethics, indeed, women pay little heed to the precepts of the founders of Christianity, and the fact has passed into proverb. Their gentleness, like the so-called honor of men, is visible only in situations which offer them no menace. The moment a woman finds herself confronted by an antagonistic genuinely dangerous, either to her own security or to the well-being of those under her protection, say a child or husband, she displays a bellicosity which stops at nothing, however outrageous. In the courts of law, one occasionally encounters a male extremist who tells the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, even when it is against his cause, but no such woman has ever been on view since the days of Justinian. It is, indeed, an axiom of the bar that women invariably lie upon the stand, and the whole effort of a barrister who has one for a client is devoted to keeping her within bounds, that the obtuse suspicions of the male jury may not be unduly aroused. Women litigants almost always win their cases, not, as is commonly assumed, because jurymen fall in love with them, but simply and solely because they are clear-headed, resourceful, implacable, and without qualms. What is here visible in the halls of justice, in the face of a vast technical equipment for combating mendacity, is 10 times more obvious in the freer fields. Any man who is so unfortunate as to have serious controversy with a woman, say in the departments of finance, theology, or amour, must inevitably carry away from it a sense of having passed through a dangerous and almost gruesome experience. Women not only bite in the clinches, they bite even in open fighting. They have a dental reach, so to speak, of amazing length. No attack is so desperate that they will not undertake it once they are aroused. No device is so unfair and horrifying that it stays them. In my early days, Desiring to improve my prose, I served for a year or so as a reporter for a newspaper and a police court, and during that time I heard perhaps 400 cases of so-called wife-beating. The husbands, in their defense, almost invariably pleaded justification, and some of them told such tales of studied atrocity at the domestic hearth, both psychic and physical, that the learned magistrate discharged them with tears in his eyes, and the very catchpoles in the courtroom had to blow their noses. Many more men than women go insane, and many more married men than single men. The fact puzzles no one who has had the same opportunity that I had to find out what goes on year in and year out behind the doors of apparently happy homes. A woman, if she hates her husband, and many of them do, can make life so sour and obnoxious to him that even death upon the gallows seems sweet by comparison. This hatred, of course, is often and perhaps almost invariably quite justified. To be the wife of an ordinary man, indeed, is an experience that must be very hard to bear. The hollowness and vanity of the fellow, his petty meanness and stupidity, his puling sentimentality and credulity, his bombastic air of a cock on a dunghill, his anesthesia to all whispers and summonings of the spirit, above all, his loathsome cleanliness in amour, all these things must revolt any woman above the lowest. To be the object of ophis affections of such a creature, even when they are honest and profound, cannot be expected to give any genuine joy to a woman of sense and refinement. His performance as a gallant, as Honore de Balzac long ago observed, unescapably suggests a gorilla's efforts to play the violin. Women survive the tragicomedy only by dint of their great capacity for play acting. They are able to act so realistically that often they deceive even themselves. The average woman's contentment, indeed, is no more than a tribute to her histrionism. But there must be innumerable revolts in secret even so, and one sometimes wonders that so few women, with the thing so facile and so safe, poison their husbands. Perhaps it's not quite as rare as vital statistics make it out. The death rate among husbands is very much higher than among wives. More than once, indeed, I have gone to the funeral of an acquaintance who died suddenly, and observed a curious glitter in the eyes of the inconsolable widow. Even in this age of emancipation, normal women have few serious transactions in life save with their husbands and potential husbands. The business of marriage is their dominant concern from adolescence to senility. When they step outside their habitual circle, they show the same alert and eager wariness that they exhibit within it. A man who has dealings with them must keep his wits about him, and even when he is most cautious, he is often flabbergasted by their sudden and unconscionable forays. Whenever a woman goes into a trade, she quickly gets a reputation as a sharp trader. Every little town in America has its heady green, each sweating blood from turnips, each the terror of all the manufacturers of the neighborhood. The man who tackles such an Amazon of barter takes his fortune into his hands. He has little more chance of success against the feminine technique in business than he has against the feminine technique in marriage. In both arenas, the advantage of women lies in their freedom from sentimentality. In business, they address themselves wholly to their own profit, and give no thought whatever to the hopes, aspirations, and amour propre of their antagonists. And in the duel of sex they fence, not to make points, but to disable and disarm. A man, when he succeeds in throwing off a woman who has attempted to marry him, always carries away a maudlin sympathy for her in her defeat and dismay. But no one ever heard of a woman who pitied the poor fellow whose honest passion she had found it expedient to spurn. On the contrary, women take delight in such clownish agonies, and exhibit them proudly, and boast about them to other women. The New Age, 42. The Transvaluation of Values. The gradual emancipation of women that has been going on for the last century has still a long way to proceed before they are wholly delivered from their traditional burdens, and so stand clear of the oppressions of men. But already, it must be plain, they have made enormous progress, perhaps more than they have made in the 10,000 years preceding. The rise of the industrial system, which has borne so harshly upon the race in general, has brought them certain unmistakable benefits. Their economic dependence, though still sufficient to make marriage highly attractive to them, is nevertheless so far broken down that large classes of women are now almost free agents, and quite independent of the favor of men. Most of these women, responding to the ideas that are still powerful, are yet intrigued of course by marriage, and prefer it to the autonomy that is coming in. but the fact remains that they now have a free choice in the matter, and that dire necessity no longer controls them. After all, they needn't marry if they didn't want to. It is possible to get their bread by their own labor in the workshops of the world. Their grandmothers were in far more difficult position. Failing marriage, they not only suffered a cruel ignominy, but in many cases faced the menace of actual starvation. There was simply no respectable place in the economy of those times for the free woman. She either had to enter a nunnery or accept the disdainful patronage that was galling as charity. Nothing could be plainer than the effect that the increasing economic security of women is having upon their whole habit of life and mind. The diminishing marriage rate and the even more rapidly diminishing birth rate show which way the wind is blowing. It is common for male statisticians, with characteristic imbecility, to ascribe the fall in the marriage rate to a growing disinclination on the male side. This growing disinclination is actually on the female side. Even though no considerable body of women has yet reached a definite doctrine that marriage is less desirable than freedom, it must be plain that large numbers of them now approach the business with far greater fastidiousness than their grandmothers or even their mothers exhibited. They are harder to please, and hence pleased less often. The woman of a century ago could imagine nothing more favorable to her than marriage. Even marriage with a fifth-rate man was better than no marriage at all. This notion is gradually feeling the opposition of a contrary notion. Women, in general, may still prefer marriage to work, but there is an increasing minority which begins to realize that work may offer the greater contentment, particularly if it be mellowed by a certain amount of philandering. There already appears in the world, indeed, a class of women who, while still not genuinely averse to marriage, are yet free from any theory that it is necessary, or even invariably desirable. Among these women are a good many somewhat vociferous propagandists, almost male in their violent earnestness. They range from the man-eating suffragists to such preachers of free motherhood as Ellen Key, and such professional shockers of the bourgeoisie as the American prophetess of birth control, Margaret Sanger. But among them are many more who wake the world with no such noisy eloquence, but content themselves with carrying out their ideas in a quiet and respectful manner. The number of such women is much larger than generally imagined, and that number tends to increase steadily. There are women who, with their economic independence assured, either by inheritance or by their own efforts, chiefly in the arts and professions, do exactly as they please, and make no pother about it. Naturally enough, their superiority to convention and the common frenzy makes them extremely attractive to the better sort of men, and so it is not uncommon for one of them to find herself voluntarily sought in marriage, without any preliminary scheming by herself. Surely an experience that very few ordinary women ever enjoy, save perhaps in dreams or delirium. The old order changeth, and giveth place to the new. Among the women's clubs and the women's colleges, I have no doubt there is still much debate of the old and silly question: are platonic relations possible between the sexes? In other words, is friendship possible without sex? Many a woman of the new order dismisses the problem with another question: why without sex? With the decay of the ancient concept of woman as property, there must come inevitably a reconsideration of the whole sex question. And out of that reconsideration there must come a revision of the medieval penalties which now punish the slightest frivolity in the female. The notion that honor in woman is exclusively a physical matter, that a single aberrance may convert a woman of the highest merits into a woman of none at all, that the sole valuable thing a woman can bring to marriage is virginity, this notion is so preposterous that no intelligent person, male or female, actually cherishes it. It survives as one of the hollow conventions of Christianity, nay, of the Levantine barbarism that preceded Christianity. As women throw off the other conventions which now bind them, they will throw off this one too, and so their virtue, grounded upon fastidiousness and self-respect instead of upon mere fear and conformity, will become a far more laudable thing than it ever can be under the present system. And for its absence, if they see fit to dispose of it, they will no more apologize than a man apologizes today. 43. The Lady of Joy. Even prostitution, in the long run, may become a more or less respectable profession, as it was in the great days of the Greeks. That quality will surely attach to it if it ever grows quite unnecessary. Whatever is unnecessary is always respectable. For example, religion, fashionable clothing, and a knowledge of Latin grammar. The prostitute is disesteemed today not because her trade involves anything intrinsically degrading or even disagreeable, but because she is currently assumed to have been driven into it by dire necessity, against her dignity and inclination. That this assumption is usually unsound is no objection to it. Nearly all the thinking of the world, particularly in the field of morals, is based upon unsound assumption. For example, that God observes the fall of the sparrow and is shocked by the fall of a Sunday school superintendent. The truth is that prostitution is one of the most attractive of the occupations practically open to the sort of women who engage in it, and that the prostitute commonly likes her work and would not exchange places with the shop girl or a waitress for anything in the world. The notion to the contrary is propagated by unsuccessful prostitutes who fall into the hands of professional reformers, and who assent to the imbecile theories of the latter in order to cultivate their goodwill, just as convicts in prison, questioned by teetotalers, always ascribe their rascality to alcohol. No prostitute of anything resembling normal intelligence is under the slightest duress. She is perfectly free to abandon her trade and go into a shop or factory or into domestic service whenever the impulse strikes her. All the prevailing gabble about white slave jails and kidnappers comes from pious rogues who make a living by feeding such nonsense to the credulous. So long as the average prostitute is able to make a good living, she is quite content with her lot, and disposed to contrast it egotistically with the slavery of her virtuous sisters. If she complains of it, then you may be sure that her success is below her expectations. A starving lawyer always sees injustice in the courts. A bad physician is a bitter critic of Ehrlich and Pasteur. And when a suburban clergyman is forced out of his cure by a vestry-room revolution, he almost invariably concludes that the sinfulness of man is incurable, and sometimes he even begins to doubt some of the typographical errors in Holy Writ. The high value set upon virginity by men, whose esteem of it is based upon a mixture of vanity and voluptuousness, causes many women to guard it in their own persons with a jealousy far beyond their private inclinations and interests. It is their theory that the loss of it would materially impair their chances of marriage. This theory is not supported by the facts. The truth is that the woman who sacrifices her chastity, everything else being equal, stands a much better chance of making a creditable marriage than the woman who remains chaste. This is especially true of women of the lower economic classes. At once they come into contact, hitherto socially difficult and sometimes almost impossible, with men of higher classes, and begin to take on, with the curious facility of their sex, the refinements and taste and points of view of those classes. The mistress thus gathers charm, and what has begun as a sordid state of amiability not uncommonly ends with formal marriage. The number of such marriages is enormously greater than appears superficially, for both parties obviously make every effort to conceal the facts. Within the circle of my necessarily limited personal acquaintance, I know of scores of men, some of them of wealth and position, who have made such marriages and do not seem to regret it. It is an old observation indeed that a woman who is previously disposed of her virtue makes a good wife. The common theory is that this is because she is grateful to her husband for rescuing her from the social outlawry. The truth is that she makes a good wife because she is a shrewd woman, and has specialized professionally in masculine weakness, and is thus extra competent at the traditional business of her sex. Such a woman often shows a truly magnificent sagacity. It is very difficult to deceive her logically, and it is impossible to disarm her emotionally. Her revolt against the pruderies and sentimentalities of the world was evidence, to begin with, of her intellectual enterprise and courage, and her success as a rebel is proof of her extraordinary pertinacity, resourcefulness, and acumen. Even the most lowly prostitute is better off in all worldly ways than the virtuous woman of her own station in life. She has less work to do, it is less monotonous and dispiriting, she meets a far greater variety of men, and they are of classes distinctly beyond her own. Nor is her occupation hazardous and her ultimate fate tragic. A dozen or more years ago I observed a somewhat amusing proof of this last. At that time, certain sentimental busybodies of the American city in which I live undertook an elaborate inquiry into prostitution therein, and some of them came to me in advance, as a practical journalist, for advice as how to proceed. I found that all of them shared the common superstition that the professional life of the average prostitute is only 5 years long, and that she invariably ends in the gutter. They were enormously amazed when they unearthed the truth. The truth was to the effect that the average prostitute of that town ended her career not in the morgue, but at the altar of God, and that those who remained unmarried often continued in practice for 10, 15, and even 20 years, and then retired on competencies. It was established, indeed, that fully 80% married, and that they almost always got husbands who would have been far beyond their reach had they remained virtuous. For one who married a cabman or petty pugilist, there were a dozen who married respectable mechanics, policemen, small shopkeepers, and minor officials, and at least 2 or 3 who married well-to-do tradesmen and professional men. Among the thousands whose careers were studied, there was actually one who ended as the wife of the town's richest banker. That is, one who bagged the best catch in the whole community. This woman had begun as a domestic servant, and abandoned that harsh and dreary life to enter a brothel. Her experiences there polished and civilized her, and in her old age she was a grande dame of the greatest dignity. Much of the sympathy wasted upon women of the ancient profession is grounded upon an error as to their own attitude toward it. An educated woman, hearing that a frail sister in a public stew is expected to be amiable to all sorts of bounders, thinks of how she would shrink from such contacts, and so concludes that the actual prostitute suffers acutely. What she overlooks is that these men, however gross and repulsive they may appear to her, are measurably superior to men of the prostitute's own class, say her father and brothers, and that communion with them, far from being disgusting, is often rather romantic. I well remember observing, during my collaboration with the vice crusaders aforesaid, the delight of a lady of joy who had attracted the notice of a police lieutenant. She was intensely pleased by the idea of having a client of such haughty manners, such brilliant dress, and what seemed to her to be so dignified a profession. It is always forgotten that this weakness is not confined to prostitutes, but runs through the whole female sex. The woman who could not imagine an illicit affair with a wealthy soap manufacturer, or even with a lawyer, finds it quite easy to imagining herself succumbing to an ambassador or a duke. There are very few exceptions to this rule. In the most reserved of modern societies, the women who represent their highest flower are notoriously complaisant to royalty. And royal women, to complete the circuit, not infrequently yield to actors and musicians, that is, to men radiating a glamour not encountered even in princes. 44. The future of marriage. The transvaluation of values that is now in progress will go on slowly and for a very long while. That it will be ever quite complete is, of course, impossible. There are inherent differences that will continue to show themselves until the end of time. As women gradually become convinced not only of the possibility of economic independence, but also of its value, she will probably lose her present overmastering desire for marriage and address herself to meeting men in free economic competition. That is to say, she will address herself to acquiring that practical competence, that high talent for puerile and chiefly mechanical expertness, which now sets man ahead of her in the labor market of the world. To do this, she will have to sacrifice some of her present intelligence. It is impossible to imagine a genuinely intelligent human being becoming a competent trial lawyer, or buttonhole worker, or newspaper sub-editor, or piano tuner, or house painter. Women, to get upon all fours with men in such stupid occupations, will have to commit spiritual suicide, which is probably much further than they will ever actually go. Thus, a shade of their present superiority to men will always remain, and with it a shade of their relative inefficiency, and so marriage will remain attractive to them, or at all events to most of them, and its overthrow will be prevented. To abolish it entirely, as certain fevered reformers propose, would be as difficult as to abolish the procession of the equinoxes. At the present time, women vacillate somewhat absurdly between 2 schemes of life, the old and the new. On the one hand, their economic independence is still full of conditions, and on the other hand, they are in revolt against the immemorial conventions. The result is a general unrest, with many symptoms of extravagant and unintelligent revolt. One of those symptoms is the appearance of intellectual striving in women. Not a striving, alas, towards the genuine pearls and rubies of the mind, but one merely towards the acquirement of the rubber stamp that men employ in their so-called thinking. Thus we have women who launch themselves into party politics and fill their heads with a vast mass of useless knowledge about political tricks, customs, theories, and personalities. Thus, too, we have the woman social reformer, trailing along ridiculously behind the tatterdemalion posse of male utopians, each with something to sell. And thus we have the woman who goes in for advanced wisdom of the sort on draft in women's clubs. In brief, the sort of wisdom which consists entirely of a body of beliefs and propositions that are ignorant, unimportant, and untrue. Such banal striving is most prodigally in display in the United States, where superficiality amounts to a national disease. Its popularity is due to the relatively greater leisure of the American people, who work less than any other people in the world, and, above all, to the relatively greater leisure of American women. Thousands of them have been emancipated from any compulsion to productive labor without having acquired any compensatory intellectual or artistic interest or social duty. The result is that they swarm in the women's clubs and waste their time listening to bad poetry, worse music, and still worse lectures on Maeterlinck, Balkan politics, and the subconscious. It is among such women that one observes the periodic rages for Bergssonism and Montessori method, the twilight sleep, and other such follies, so pathetically characteristic of American culture. One of the evil effects of this tendency I have hitherto descanted upon, to wit, the growing disposition of American women to regard all routine labor, particularly in the home, as infra dignitatem, and hence intolerable. Out of that notion arise many lamentable phenomena. On the one hand, we have the spectacle of a great number of healthy and well-fed women engaged in public activities that, 9 times out of 10, are meaningless, mischievous, and a nuisance. And on the other hand, we behold such a decay in the domestic arts that at first onslaught of the late war, the national government had to import a foreign expert to teach the housewives of the country the various elements of thrift. No such instruction was needed by the housewives of the continent. They were simply told how much food they could have, and the natural competence did the rest. There is never any avoidable waste there, either in peace or in war. A French housewife has little use for a garbage can, save as a depository for uplifting literature. She does her best with the means at her disposal, not only in wartime, but at all times. As I have said over and over again in this inquiry, a woman's disinclination to acquire the intricate expertness that lies at the bottom of good housekeeping is due primarily to her active intelligence. It is difficult for her to concentrate her mind upon such stupid and meticulous enterprises. But whether difficult or easy, it is obviously important for the average woman to make some effort in that direction, for if she fails to do so, there is chaos. That chaos is duly visible in the United States. Here women reveal one of their subterranean qualities, their deficiency in conscientiousness. They are quite without that dog-like fidelity to duty which is one of the shining marks of men. They never summon up a high pride in doing what is inherently disagreeable. They always go to the galleys under protest and with vows of sabotage. Their fundamental philosophy is almost that of the syndicalists. The sentimentality of men connives at this, and is thus largely responsible for it. Before the average spoiler, apprentice in the kitchen, can pick up the fourth of the culinary subtleties that are commonplace even to the chefs on dining cars, she has caught a man, and need concern herself about them no more, for he has to eat, in the last analysis, whatever she sets before him, and his lack of intelligence makes it easy for her to shut off his academic criticisms by bald appeal to his emotions. By an easy process, he finally attaches a positive value to her indolence. It is a proof, he concludes, of her fineness of soul. In the presence of her lofty incompetence, he is abashed. But as women, gaining economic autonomy, meet men in progressively bitterer competition, the rising masculine distrust and fear of them will be reflected even in the enchanted domain of marriage, and the husband, having yielded up most of his old rights, will begin to reveal a new jealousy of those that remain, and particularly of the right to a fair quid pro quo for his own docile industry. In brief, as women shake off their ancient disabilities, they will also shake off some of their ancient immunities, and their doings will come to be regarded with a soberer and more exigent scrutiny than now prevails. The extension of the suffrage, I believe, will encourage this awakening. In wresting it from the reluctant male, the women of the Western world have planted dragon's teeth, which will presently leap up and gnaw them. Now that women have the political power to obtain their just rights, they will begin to lose their old power to obtain special privileges by sentimental appeals. Men, facing them squarely, will consider them anew, not as romantic political and social invalids, to be coddled and caressed, but as free competitors in a harsh world. When that reconsideration gets under way, there will be a general overhauling of the relations between the sexes, and some of the fair ones, I suspect, will begin to wonder why they didn't let well enough alone. 45. Effects of the war. The present series of wars, it seems likely, will continue for 20 or 30 years and perhaps longer. That the first clash was inconclusive was shown brilliantly by the preposterous nature of the peace finally reached, a peace so artificial and dishonest that the signing of it was almost equivalent to a new declaration of war. At least 3 new contests in the grand matter are plainly in sight. One between Germany and France to rectify the unnatural tyranny of a weak and incompetent nation over a strong and enterprising nation. One between Japan and the United States for the mastery of the Pacific, and one between England and the United States for control of the sea. To these must be added various minor struggles and perhaps 1 or 2 of almost major character. The effort of Russia to regain her own unity and power, the effort of the Turks to put down the slave rebellion, of Greeks, Armenian, Arabs, etc., which now menaces them, the effort of the Latin Americans to throw off the galling Yankee yoke, and the joint effort of Russia and Germany, perhaps with England and Italy aiding, to get rid of such international nuisances as the insane Polish Republic, the petty states of the Baltic, and perhaps also most of the Balkan states. I pass over the probability of a new mutiny in India, of the rising of China against the Japanese, and of a general struggle for a new alignment of boundaries in South America. All of these wars, great and small, are probable. Most of them are humanly certain. They will be fought ferociously and with the aid of destructive engines of the utmost efficiency. They will bring about an unparalleled butchery of men, and a large proportion of these men will be under 40 years of age. As a result, there will be a shortage of husbands in Christendom, and as a second result, the survivors will be appreciably harder to snare than the men of today. Every man of agreeable exterior and easy means will be pursued, not merely by a few dozen or a score of women as now, but by whole battalions and brigades of them, and he will be driven in sheer self-defense into very sharp bargaining. Perhaps in the end the state will have to interfere in the business to prevent the potential husband going to waste in the turmoil of opportunity. Just what form this interference is likely to take has not yet appeared clearly. In France, there is already a wholesale legitimization of children born out of wedlock, and in Eastern Europe there has been a clamor for the legalization of polygamy. But these devices do not meet the main problem, which is the encouragement of monogamy to the utmost. A plan that suggests itself is the amelioration of the position of the monogamous husband, now rendered increasingly uncomfortable by the laws of most Christian states. I do not think that the more intelligent sort of women, faced by a perilous shortage of men, would object seriously to that amelioration. They must see plainly that the present system, if it is carried much further, will begin to work powerfully against their best interests, if only by greatly reinforcing the disinclination of marriage that already exists among the better sort of men. The woman of true discretion, I am convinced, would much rather marry a superior man, even on unfavorable terms, than make John Smith her husband, serf, and prisoner at one stroke. The law must eventually recognize this fact and make provision for it. The average husband, perhaps, deserves little succor. The woman who pursues and marries him, though she may be moved by selfish aims, should be properly rewarded by the state for her service to it, a service surely not to be lightly estimated in a military age. And that reward may conveniently take the form, as in the United States, of statutes giving her title to a large share of his real property and requiring him to surrender most of his income to her, and releasing her from all obedience to him and from all obligation to keep his house in order. But the woman who aspires to higher game should be quite willing, it seems to me, to resign some of these advantages in compensation for the greater honor and satisfaction of being wife to a man of merit, and mother to his children. All that is needed is laws allowing her, if she will, to resign her right of dower, her right to maintenance, and her immunity from discipline, and to make any other terms that she may be led to regard as equitable. At present, women are unable to make the most of these concessions, even if they would. The laws of the majority of Western nations are inflexible. If, for example, an Englishwoman should agree, by an antenuptial contract, to submit herself to discipline not of the current statutes, but of the elder common law, which allowed a husband to correct his wife corporally with a stick no thicker than his thumb, it would be competent for any sentimental neighbor to set this agreement at naught by hauling her husband before a magistrate for carrying it out, and it is a safe wager that the magistrate would jail him. This plan, however novel it may seem, is actually already in operation. Many a married woman, in order to keep her husband from revolt, makes more or less disguised surrender of certain of the rights and immunities that she has under existing laws. There are, for example, even in America, women who practice the domestic arts with competence and diligence, despite the plain fact that no legal penalty would be visited upon them if they failed to do so. There are women who follow external trades and professions, contributing a share to the family exchequer. There are women who obey their husbands, even against their best judgments. There are, most numerous of all, women who wink discreetly at their husbandly departures, overt or in mere intent, from the oath of chemical purity taken at the altar. It is a commonplace, indeed, that many happy marriages admit a party of the third part. There would be more of them if there were more women with enough serenity of mind to see the practical advantage of the arrangement. The trouble with such triangulations is not primarily that they involve perjury, or that they offer any fundamental offense to the wife. If she avoids banal theatricals, in fact, they commonly have the effect of augmenting the husband's devotion to her and respect for her, if only as the fruit of comparison. The trouble with them is that very few men among us have sense enough to manage them intelligently. The masculine mind is readily taken in by specious values. The average married man of Protestant Christendom, if he succumbs at all, succumbs to some meretricious and flamboyant creature bent only upon fleecing him. Here is where the harsh realism of the Frenchman shows its superiority to the sentimentality of the men of the Teutonic races. A Frenchman would no more think of taking a mistress without consulting his wife than he would think of standing for office without consulting his wife. The result is that he is seldom victimized. For one Frenchman ruined by women, there are at least 100 Englishmen and Americans, despite the fact that 100 times as many Frenchmen engage in that sort of recreation. The case of Zola is typical. As is well known, his amours were carefully supervised by Madame Zola from the first days of their marriage, and in consequence his life was wholly free from scandals, and his mind was never distracted from his work. 46. The Eternal Romance. But whatever the future of monogamous marriage, there will never be any decay of that agreeable adventurousness which now lies at bottom of all transactions between the sexes. Women may emancipate themselves, they may borrow the whole bag of masculine tricks, and they may cure themselves of their present desire for the vegetable security of marriage, but they will never cease to be women, and so long as they are women, they will remain provocative to men. Their chief charm today lies precisely in the fact that they are dangerous, that they threaten masculine liberty and autonomy, that their sharp minds present a menace vastly greater than that of acts of God and the public enemy, and they will be dangerous forever. Men fear them and are fascinated by them. They know how to show their teeth charmingly. The more enlightened of them have perfected a superb technique of fascination. It was Nietzsche who called them the recreation of the warrior, not of the poltroon, remember, but of the warrior. A profound saying. They have an infinite capacity for rewarding masculine industry and enterprise with small and irresistible flatteries. Their acute understanding combines with their capacity for evoking ideas of beauty to make them incomparable companions when the serious business of the day is done, and the time has come to expand comfortably in the interstellar ether. Every man, I dare say, has his own notion of what constitutes perfect peace and contentment, but all of those notions, despite the fundamental conflict of the sexes, revolve around women. As for me, and I hope I may be pardoned at this late stage of my inquiry for intruding my own personality, I reject the two commonest of them. Passion, at least in its more adventurous and melodramatic aspects, is too exciting and alarming for so indolent a man, and I am too egotistic to have much desire to be mothered. What, then, remains for me? Let me try to describe it to you. It is the close of a busy and vexatious day, say 5:30 or 6 of a winter afternoon. I have had a cocktail or two, and am stretched out on a divan in front of the fire, smoking. At the edge of the divan, close enough for me to reach her with my hand, sits a woman not too young, but still good-looking and well-dressed. Above all, a woman with a soft, low-pitched, agreeable voice. As I snooze, she talks. Of anything, everything, all the things that women talk of. Books, music, the play, men, other women. No politics, no business, no religion, no metaphysics. Nothing challenging and vexatious. But remember, she is intelligent. What she says is clearly expressed, and often picturesquely. I observe the fine sheen of her hair, the pretty cut of her frock, the glint of her white teeth, the arch of her eye, the graceful curve of her arm. I listen to the exquisite murmur of her voice. Gradually, I fall asleep, but only for an instant. At once observing it, she raises her voice ever so little, and I am awake. Then to sleep again, slowly and charmingly down that slippery hill of dreams, and then awake again, and then asleep again, and so on. I ask you seriously, could anything be more unutterably beautiful? The sensation of falling asleep is to me the most exquisite in the world. I delight in it so much that I even look forward to death itself with a sneaking wonder and desire. Well, here is sleep poeticized and made doubly sweet. Here is sleep set to the finest music in the world. I match this situation against any that you can think of. It is not only enchanting, it is also, in a very true sense, ennobling. In the end, when the girl grows prettily miffed and throws me out, I return to my sorrows somehow purged and glorified. I am a better man in my own sight. I have grazed upon the fields of asphodel. I have been genuinely, completely, and unregrettably happy. 47. Apologia in conclusion. At the end, I crave the indulgence of the cultured reader for the imperfections necessarily visible in all that I have here set down. Imperfections not only due to incomplete information and fallible logic, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to certain fundamental weaknesses of the sex to which I have the honor to belong. Man is inseparable from his congenital vanities and stupidities, as a dog is inseparable from its fleas. They reveal themselves in everything he says and does, but they reveal themselves most of all when he discusses the majestic mystery of woman. Just as he smirks and rolls his eyes in her actual presence, so he puts on a pathetic and unescapable clownishness when he essays to dissect her in the privacy of the laboratory. There is no book on woman by a man that is not a stupendous compendium of posturings and imbecilities. There are but two books that show even a superficial desire to be honest. The unexpurgated Case Against Woman Suffrage by Sir Almroth Wright, and this one. Wright made a gallant attempt to tell the truth, but before he got halfway through his task, his ineradicable donkeyness as a male overcame his scientific frenzy as a psychologist, and so he hastily washed his hands of the business and affronted the judicious with a half-baked and preposterous book. Perhaps I have failed too, and even more ingloriously. If so, I am full of sincere and indescribable regret.